Okay, so Julius will take questions at the end of the program. So this month we are joined by Julius Wilm. I hope I pronounced that right, because I was going to ask you ahead of time and then all that happened, to talk about populist politics and settlement practice, free land in Arkansas from 1830 to 1920. Julius is a postdoctoral researcher at Leipzig University's Collaborative Research Project 1199, Processes of Spatialization Under the Global Condition. In his book, Settlers as Conquerors, Free Land Policy in Antebellum Arkansas, Antebellum America, published in 2018, he traces the history of early federal free land schemes and their role as instruments of conquering indigenous lands. So Julius, I'm just going to turn it over to you. I am going to put the link to that cool map project that you did, because that is super cool.
Thanks.
So everybody give Julius a warm virtual welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm gonna jump right into it, and hopefully there's enough time for me to get to all the different parts I was talking about. This is the first time I get to discuss my dissertation research, which for about a quarter or so of my book deals with Arkansas history. This is the first time I get to present this in front of a crowd that's actually interested in Arkansas history. So this is really great. So to start, I have a question. Hopefully you can read all of it on the screen. And just as an aspiration, try to think what seems like a plausible answer to the answer of how many times more there were homesteads in the state of Kansas than in Arkansas between the 60s and the 1930s. Does 5.85 times sound about right? 3.61 times, 1.27 times, or 0.67 times? Just select one, what seems plausible. So the correct answer is 1.7 times. There were 1.7 times as many claims in Kansas as there were in Arkansas. And the reason I asked this question as an opener is that if you looked at scholarly literature and popular histories, you will hear a lot more about homesteading in Kansas history than you will in Arkansas history. And that's kind of odd, because if you look at numbers, there's actually comparative history in some ways. There's also important differences that I will point out later, but 143,940 settler households fight for free land in Arkansas between the 60s and the 30s. And 182,474 settler households fired in Kansas. So very roughly, it's in the same ballpark. And if you look at the percentages of the people who succeeded in becoming landowners via homesteading, it's also quite similar. It's actually slightly more successful in Arkansas than in Kansas. So why is free land not thought of as something that matters for Arkansas history? That's a bit of a mystery, and the mystery that I hope will make this talk a bit more interesting. So I'm going to talk about three different elements of free land politics and practices in Arkansas between the antebellum 1830s and the 1930s. So it's a 100-year history, starting from a free land campaign in the 1830s over a state law passed in 1840 that remained on the books for some decades, and then look at homesteading under federal statutes following the Civil War and into the 1930s. Most of what I say, as it's been announced, is based on my book entitled Settlers as Conquerors. It is a little pricey if you try to buy it in the United States, especially if you are interested in more of the background of this and also the context of how Arkansas policy ties into national larger national debates and so on. Do get in touch with me. I do have a PDF version of this that I can just send around. Secondly, it also builds on my present research on the Homestead Act, and there is a freely available interactive web map, which I have linked here. And if you don't manage to write down this link, if you get in touch, I'm happy to share this information. As I hope the window doesn't cover any of the text, as a background to think about what free land politics looked like in the 1820s and then in the 1830s when it was a big political thing in Arkansas, one needs to think about the way that the US government worked at the time. So Western territories and states had representation in Washington, but this did not mean that they had particularly much power in Washington. So as states, they would have 2 senators. In the House of Representatives, even the most Western areas that had passed into statehood had very little power. Like most of the political power in the House of Representatives was concentrated on the East Coast. This meant that whatever demands Westerners had to Washington for aid and various shapes for getting their communities more developed, infrastructure, public investment, all sorts of things, or getting access to free land instead of having to pay for every piece of ground that was turned into farms owned by settlers. This had to be addressed in the language of national goals. So governmental cohesion was a big one. Westerners would often raise the prospect that the cohesion of the United States just required a more friendly policy towards frontier whites because there were other empires around. Like people could leave for Texas, they could leave for Mexico, they could leave for Canada. And so this comes up a lot in the debates at the time. Defense is another one. Westerners tend to talk about whatever they want access to, whether it's postal roads, whether it's canals, whether it's, again, free land, as something that matters for defending the area against indigenous nations. And so a lot of the discourse that reaches Washington from, be it Arkansas, but also be it some other Western territory, tends to play up the necessity of defense. And on the other hand, there's also the more hardline version, which is talking directly about the enforcement of indigenous dispossession. So that's the more offensive version of the same argument. Settlers will conquer territory for the United States. And this gets attached to demands that settlers had anyhow, like that grow out of their own concerns. But they're reframed when local politicians or settlers in their petitions to Washington want to address this in Washington because they need to connect with national goals, and the development of a frontier community is not important enough. So this is a quotation. Again, I hope the little window does not cover up the quotation by one of the 2 initial senators Arkansas had in the 1830s, William S. Fulton. He said about his free land bill, no measure having for its object only the settlement of the country could hope to find favor at this time with the Congress, but the present measure proposes the grant of lands already called over, so land that had already been offered for sale, and in consideration for perils and services to be rendered upon a national object of the first magnitude and importance. This is the selling point. This is how free land is argued for in Washington. This logic of selling a demand from the West as something that's really good for national cohesion and national projects is already evident during an 1820s very elaborate free land campaign that started from Missouri. So Thomas Howard Benton, Jacksonian senator, starts campaigning for free land to be made available in Western territories, on the argument that this will restore and strengthen the attachment of Westerners to the United States government. The argument is people might be leaving for independent Mexico after independence, 1819, or for Texas when Texas becomes independent. No, wait, that's later. Sorry, that actually doesn't make a lot of sense. It's Mexico and it's Canada, where the governments do make available free land, was not available in the United States. So Thomas Howard Benton and lots of petitioners and these Western territorial legislatures sent memorials, told their representatives to make the case. People will not stay because there's free land. This campaign ends by the end of the 20s, and it's interesting because the United States Census is, of course, published right then. And you can see that the population of Missouri doubled during the 20s. So the argument that Western territories would be losing population was actually hard to make after that came out. And so in I think 1829, Missouri's legislature first pitches another version of a similar argument, but it's much more sinister because the argument comes up, well, if the southeastern tribes are being removed to Indian Territory, which then covered both Kansas and present-day Oklahoma, these are dangerous people, and we will have to keep a check on them. And that's why the United States government should grant us free land on the condition of militia service, so that we'll keep a check on these people. And this idea is then picked up by territorial politicians from Arkansas, and eventually turned into a bill once Arkansas becomes a state in 1936. It's pushed by William Fulton and Ambrose Sevier in the Senate. And there's quite a lot of material that's sent towards Washington that tries to really smear the survivors of the Trail of Tears, the removal from the Southeast, as a menace and a danger that needs to be checked with the help of a militia that a free land law could pass. So I guess I'll just do the second two quotations, and these are from a much larger collection. A petition from Washington, Crawford, and Scott counties in November 1836 argued, "We anticipate the day not far distant when the Creeks and Seminoles, full of hatred and resentment against white people, will influence the nations around already in the country to rise up against the citizens of Arkansas and Missouri." William S. Fulton, as part of a campaign for a bill, which is at this time already in some peril, he has noticed, turns this pitch up still further. And he tells his fellow senators, the indiscriminate slaughter of the whole population of both of those states, Arkansas and Missouri, might take place before the government could be informed a war had commenced. And so this type of discourse is sent towards Washington as part of a pitch of a free land bill for the western part of Arkansas and also Missouri once there's representation in the United States Senate. Fulton again says, quote, "No cheaper plan could be adopted for placing a strong and permanent force all along the frontier than by offering the lands which can only be occupied at the greatest hazard by those who are prepared to peril everything in the defense." And again, this is premised on militia service, and the exact layout of the proposals vary. Sometimes petitions ask for the more or less the western half of the state being a free land zone. In Fulton's version, it becomes a 12-mile corridor along the western border of Arkansas and Missouri. So this is lobbied for and then presented as a bill in 1836. It is strongly rejected in June of 1838 in a 9-29 Senate vote, which, if the same vote was taken in the House of Representatives and the share of representatives would vote along the same party lines, would be much more devastating in the House because eastern states were much stronger there. It's really just the buy-in from very few western states into the scheme. And the reason for this is likely the testimony that has reached Washington from military officers who are stationed on the border of Indian Territory. So from Fort Corfee, there's a letter arriving that says, "It is strenuously urged by some of the people of Arkansas that the troops should be located within the state." They also asked for more troops in order to protect the people from Indian aggressions. There are but very few of them, however, who are sincere in the belief that they have any just grounds to apprehend danger from the Indians. If there are any who are so unfortunate to be in dread of Indian aggressions, they should recollect that the two great and civilized tribes, the Cherokee and Choctaw, immediately between them and those that they could only have the very least ground to fear. So this testimony arrives Washington, and it pretty much shuts down this proposal. It's presented again in 1839 and 40, but there's no discussion and nothing going on. Meanwhile, back in Little Rock, the state auditor has figured out a way in which Arkansas will just be able to grant free land to settlers on its own. So as a result of the War of 1812, there was a big tract of military so-called bounty land in the eastern part of the state. I'll have a map a little later on, which was granted to soldiers for their services in the War of 1812, and much of this land was never claimed or had been sold off to investors and was then never really taken possession of. And so for failure of paying state taxes, a lot of this had ended up in the ownership of the state government. And Conway here suggests that this could be used, quote, to encourage the settlement and improvement of these wide and uncultivated lands, and at the same time to augment the revenue and afford to the poor and industrious homes at a cheap rate. It is recommended that a law be passed donating to every individual who would settle upon and improve a quarter section of such land the right of the state thereto. And this he proposes in his annual report in October. In December, the legislature passes this on the state level. And this gives settlers access to 160 acres per household of tax-forfeited land if they're willing to pay the taxes that are due on them. There is very notably absolutely no requirement of militia enlistment in this law, but it's very remarkable because all the proposals that had been sent to Washington talked about the necessity for building up the Arkansas state militia, and this just played absolutely no role when the state was free to open land on its own. There are, according to 1847 list, there are 480,000 acres roughly available, which is enough for 3,000 parcels. So I'm guessing they measured up 3,000 parcels and offered that, which is a lot by comparison. 3,000 parcels. If you look at antebellum free land laws in the 1840s, there's one in Florida that's federal, and it's only 1,250 parcels that are available. So this is a major program. It's also quite accessible compared to federal programs at the time, because Florida is not very desirable at the time. There are major health hazards, uncontrolled malaria epidemics. It's too hard to plant things. Land in Arkansas is very much readily available for people coming to the state. A second free land law was then passed on the federal level for Oregon, and again, it involved having to move across the entire continent. Arkansas land was available for free. So in this map, I have mapped townships that had donation state lands available in 1847. And as you can see, most of it is in the east. And if you compare this with a map of the boundary lands of the War of 1812, they're pretty similar. There are some tracts that don't seem to be within the boundary land, but most of the land was clearly from the United States boundary lands. So this law, it's not actually clear to me when this is taken out of use. It is used for quite some decades. Back when I did research in Arkansas, it was not very accessible to find out a lot of statistical information about when what amount of land was claimed or returned to the state and so on. But there was one figure from 1871 which said that 1,700 applicants had filed for state donation land in just that 1 year, which again is actually quite significant compared to what other programs there are, or federal homesteading, as we will see in a little bit. So these are federal homesteads in Arkansas following the Civil War. Original homesteads are the ones that are first filed. Final homesteads demark homesteads that have been turned into full property titles by residency. And as you can see, there's a substantial number across the decades. It remains a significant, remains at pretty high levels until roughly World War I. If you compare this again to Kansas, you get a picture where Kansas is in some ways a very quintessential homesteading state. It has these big spikes in the years up to 1889, which Arkansas did never have. However, at around 1890, for most of the years, there were actually more homesteaders filing for land in Arkansas than in Kansas, which is counterintuitive and is not reflected in a lot of literature, I would argue. Again, if you look at this map, which I made of homestead claims only for the first 50 years, and at which offices they were filed, you can see there is a substantial number of claims in Arkansas, but also places like Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Missouri too. Again, this is a bit of a surprise because I think some of it has to do with the lack of just statistical information. But the Deep South is not thought of as homesteading countries, not even in like a reduced way. It's not that most of the homesteading, as you can see, did go on in the Great Plains, but homesteading is just not there. And it is a bit surprising, right? So Alabama and Mississippi got statehood after the War of 1812. Why would there be this much public land left? There was, for some reason. Again, you can also look at statistics for these other southern states. It goes on for a long time. And I don't have the slide here, but in quite a few of the other homesteading spots, it actually breaks off earlier. So in Arkansas and other southern states, you did have homesteading going on into the 1920s, whereas in Wisconsin, there was very little at that point. So why is, again, going back to the little mystery, why is Arkansas not thought of as a freelance state? And more widely, why is the Deep South not thought of as a free land area? So one thing is that this earliest campaign, which I pointed out to you, of the 1830s is clearly not an uplifting story. Even at the time, like with military people weighing in, it was thought of as a really strongly racist thing to do, to declare that the 5 civilized tribes were impossible to live with and needed to be checked on, and they were on the verge of starting a war. That's one reason. It will never have been a part of commemoration of Arkansas history for that reason. Among historians, I think there's also a tendency to conflate the opposition of Southerners or like congressional representatives during the 1850s, their opposition towards a homestead law with a general opposition from the South or the settlement practice. So what I mean by that is in the later 1850s, all the southern states are solidly against homesteading. The reason is, I would argue, that this is about the section, and the slaveholders in the South fear that Minnesota is going to be a state. They fear that Kansas is going to come in as a free state, and that would undercut the power. However, if you look at the strategy of giving out land to settlers who would take it, that is not so incompatible with either antebellum Southern society or postbellum Southern society. Alabama actually passed a homestead law after secession, again, as a tool to bind people to the state. That's a conflation that I think has led to the Deep South not showing up in any homesteading history. Thirdly, statistics were also not available in a very ready form, and the statistics that were available suggested catastrophic failure rates in the South. So during the early years, for probably more capacity reasons than things going so badly. People seemed to not finish their homesteads at much higher rates in the South than the rest of the country, but it actually evens out if you go into the 1880s, 1890s, and so on. It's not particularly unsuccessful. Finally, that's the question of who did homestead in Arkansas and throughout the Deep South. I just have statistics. I have no access to the books where names were taken of people who homesteaded. I do think it's likely that people who homesteaded in Arkansas or in other southern states may have been socially marginalized, probably left through sources, so it didn't become a part of state histories either. There is also the interesting question of what homesteading meant under the system of Jim Crow, because as a sort of surprising statistical fact it is that in some of these Deep South states, in all of these Deep South states, African American land ownership was on the rise during the years of the most severe repression. So between 1877 and 1910, land ownership rates rose among African Americans in these states. Maybe the federal Homestead Act is a part of that question. I find it very hard to say anything substantial beyond that. It is certainly a topic to research. I think my argument of this talk is Arkansas, to a stronger extent than some other southern states, but was a freeland state, and that in many ways, looking at this more deeply could add to the social history of Arkansas. And the whole history of freeland in Arkansas is clearly a complicated one, but I think it might open new avenues for understanding the social fabric of Southern society, both before the Civil War and after. So, thank you.
Thank you, Julius. Okay, let's see if I can. Okay, let's see here. Trying not to fall over the 9 million cords. Okay. I think I've got it set up to the television. We'll see if I made that work. I thought about that right after I sat down. I will get those PDF, that information from you, Julius, because everybody's asking for it. So I will get that and make sure everybody gets.
Sure. Yes, I can send that to you.
Okay, wait, hang on. Where's the remote? There's the remote. Okay, now say something.
Should I say something?
Yes, perfect. Okay, how's that, guys? Okay. Yay, we've got you hooked up. Now they can hear you out of the TV speakers. Wow, this has been an experience. Okay. So we have questions and they're just flying in the chat, and I'm going to start with the first one I see. Guy Lancaster would like to know what drew you in particular to this topic.
Well, I found some of these. I was working on history of settler colonialism and looked at petitions from all of the Western United States. and that's where I found a lot of material from Arkansas, which I didn't think had been used adequately, and that's how I got interested.
And then a couple of people would like to know, how did German residents learn of settling into Arkansas in the 1890s?
I think there's an account that it's also used in Arkansas history writing. There's a guy called Friedrich Gerstecker, or I guess Frederick Gerstecker or something like that, might be the US pronunciation. And he's written a travel book and a novel about traveling in the West, but he was in Arkansas for a long time. And it's called, I forgot the title, but that travel book was quite influential, and you can still buy it. It's still out there as a new, it's still being published.
Well, she is. Kathleen Condre is on, she's in the chat. And I think she said in a program we had about a year ago about Das Arkansas Echo, that there were also advertisements in newspapers in Germany attracting, encouraging people. Kathleen, correct me if I'm wrong, if I misremembered what you said. So let me take do anybody got a question here in the audience, in our in-person audience, who were extremely patient with me earlier? Anybody? Okay, I just didn't want to leave y'all out and just focus on the Zoom folks. So Kathleen does have a question. Are you familiar with Herman? I'm not even, thank you. Argument that German, Irish, and Scottish settlers formed a buffer against attacks existing Anglo-Saxon communities during the French and Indian War in the frontier areas in the 1700s. Any idea if this existing concept influenced the thinking in the antebellum period?
I think I cover a lot of this in my book. And what's surprising about this is that they talk a lot about these colonial precedents. And so one thing that happens when the US becomes a nation is they have a national government that starts to sell land. And before that, there had been more grants. And so in a lot of this talk about free land, they go back to colonial examples. And it's surprising because, again, a lot of the literature would say, oh, it's Thomas Jefferson, it's the Jeffersonian dream of the little house, but they talk a lot about these really not democratic precedents.
Drew Ulrich, who's out in Helena, says, how successful were immigration societies of the state and counties to attracting domestic and international immigrants?
I don't know so much about these immigration societies. I know I looked at letters from the government. I think it was called the Land Office, that was like passing out these grants, and they did receive a lot of letters from all of the East Coast of people who wanted to come to the state when they heard about that. Like it seemed to work.
And then he has a follow-up question, but I'm gonna actually, hey, Guy or Allie, can y'all link to the travel book, the entry on the EOA in the chat for folks, because they're asking for it?
Yes, I will.
Let's see. And then Drew also says, do you know of any Canadians or European immigrants who forsake Canada coming down here to start anew on our land?
Canadians coming to the United States?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. I don't know particularly much about that.
Okay. Lisa Egner, I think is the correct pronunciation, says, my grandfather got permission from the community council to come to Arkansas. Lisa, where was your grandfather? If you'll put that in the chat.
In Germany?
Well, that's what, yeah.
Althausen.
Yes, Althausen, Germany. Cool.
Yes, people needed to ask for permission to leave.
We think of that as more of a 20th century Cold War kind of thing. And well, Julius, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for your patience. Thank you everybody for your patience today with technology going as it did. Next month, we will be with an in-person speaker, but we're going to still do it hybrid and hopefully the technology will work for us. It is Randy Duncan, and he's going to talk about the art of comics. We have an exhibit downstairs in the underground gallery, Illustrated Arkansas. And so he is kind of the co-curator of that. And so he's going to talk about the art of comics. So that will be December 4th at noon in, I'm guessing 124. We'll see how it works. Thanks everybody for joining us. And thank you, Julius, so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks for hosting me.
And I will get the links and the PDFs and send it to everybody from you later. So
Perfect.
Great. Have a good evening.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.